class today is going to be making your own moldings for cabinets and for picture frames. So we're going to cover kind of a broad array of techniques here. But the central premise is that we're going to show you how to kind of stimulate your imagination a little bit and use, hopefully, tools you already have, not have to go out and spend a whole lot of extra money, and still be able to make custom moldings that you can use on cabinetry and for making picture frames. And why would you want to do that? Well, you got lots of moldings available at the lumberyard, right? You can go in and buy shoe and roundovers and Cove and all that kind of thing. The reason you would want to make custom moldings is it's easy to, number one, match the wood in your project, right? Because you can buy the lumber for the moldings at the same time they buy the lumber for the project. So you can pick and choose lumber that has the same color, same grain. And of course, the other reason is you can make what you want. You're not limited to all the stuff that's sitting there on the shelf leaning up in the bins at the lumberyard. And that's kind of what I want to get to, is how to make these custom profiles and how to come up with ideas for all those kind of things. Really, what it comes down to is we're going to create profiles using both the table saw and the router. We're not going to make a whole lot of sawdust in here today. I'm not going to show you these things, but we're just going to talk about how using those two simple tools, which, does everybody have a table saw? How about a router table? That's pretty much everybody. So using those two things, you can produce everything we'll talk about today. And then the basic idea of combining these basic shapes you can make on the router and the table saw to create appealing moldings. So let's talk about the profiles you can easily make using those two tools. This one's about as basic as it comes, isn't it? Square. You can do that on the table saw very easily. Imagine you've got a 3/4 inch thick piece like that. Okay, now you've got a 3/4 inch face on there. Now if you turn it up on edge, you can make that flat face as wide as is appropriate. So you're not just limited to the thickness of your lumber, you can turn it up on edge to gain more thickness. Dental molding. This is really a square with some personality to it. So you've got, this says dental 1-to-1. What that means is you've got a raised field. I keep wanting to point to my screen, realizing you guys can't see that. I can get my mouse here. Can you guys see that up on the screen? Yeah. So you got a raised field right here, and then you've got a recess right here that creates the raised field. This is shallow dado across the edge. So 1-to-1 means the ratio of this is 1-to-1. So if that's 3/4 of an inch thick, it's 3/4 of an inch that way. And then you've got also next to it the same dimension on the recess, 1-to-1. Dental molding can also be 2-to-1. These are not the only ratios, by the way. These are just a couple of examples. So here again, you've got 3/4 by 3/4, and the dado next to it is 3/8, half of the width of your dental. And this is easy to make on the table saw. If you've ever made box joints, you're probably familiar with a box joint jig. And this is very simple. We've got, you start with an auxiliary fence on your table saw. Set up your dado blade for what you want that recess thickness to be. In this case, I've chosen 3/8 because that's giving that 2-to-1 profile. Make a pass through the fence, cut a little piece of scrap, and glue a key in here. Now, one thing to remember is that key has to be shallower than the cut you're going to make. So if your cut's 3/16 deep, make that key about 1/8. So that way your piece is going to rest flat on the table saw. That key isn't going to hold it up. Then you're going to move this key over the distance of that field. So in this case, we want 3/4 by 3/4. That distance from there to there is 3/4 of an inch. Fasten the auxiliary fence to the table saw. Now I can make a cut. Let's see. Right below you, Paul. First cut, we're just going to butt it up against there. And here's the issue. I'd cut this at home with my dado set. Different dado set here. So I'm just a little bit too thick on my key. But you get the idea. This will fit over the key, fit flat, you make another pass. Now I'm creating dental molding. You can do it on a wide strip like this, and then start ripping narrower strips from it. Or you can simply stand it on edge and do it like this. If you need something a little flatter, if you need more glue surface, do it on the edge of a wider piece. That way you can create more glue surface. If you've got a piece, you got a really nice bit of grain, try doing it this way so you get kind of a matched grain from that strip you're going to rip multiples from. Okay, so that's dental molding. Chamfers. You have chamfer bits. You can route a 45 degree and a 60 degree chamfer with readily available router bits. Any other chamfers you want to cut at any other angle, just tilt your table saw blade. Make that cut. So we've got chamfers we can work with. These are obviously a nice way to transition from one plane to another. Roundovers. Got roundover bits in all kinds of sizes, quarter, 3/8, half. So you can make roundovers of various sizes. Beads, kind of like dental molding. This is a roundover with some personality. You have a special bead. Now, a bead bit is different than a roundover bit because a bead bit will have these two fillets at the top and bottom. If you don't have a roundover bit, you might consider buying instead a beading bit, because you can use it to make the roundovers by carefully setting the fence and the height of the bit so that you're just getting the roundover portion. And then when you want a bead, you've got that available. So it's a little more finicky to set up than just a roundover bit, but you got a little more uses out of that. With a roundover bit, typically you've just got one fillet on the bottom, so you can get a roundover with a shoulder, but with the bead you can get both. I keep doing that again, pointing to the screen. You can get both those shoulders up there. Ogees. Ogees are simply one radius that flows into another, typically. There might be a small flat area between them, and this shows, as you can see in the profile here, this shows perfect circular arcs that are joined here. You'll see a lot of variations in Ogee bits too, because some of those times the arc is flattened out, so it's much broader curve. And you might see, again, some that have just a little bit of flatter area where the two curves join. So this is an Ogee with a cove and then a roundover. You reverse that profile, and you end up with a Roman Ogee. So now we've got the roundover on the top. See there, we got the square from the Ogee. Now we've got the roundover on the top. That's a Roman Ogee. Cove moldings. Cove moldings, again, come in a variety, or cove bits come in a variety of sizes, 1/8, quarter, half inch on up. This one shows on a 3/4 inch. This is about a 3/8, a half-inch cove on a 3/4 inch bit, or 3/4 inch thick piece. You can buy them again in all kinds of sizes. So the idea is you'll then mix and match profiles. If you like drawing, you can do that on paper. I've seen it recommended from other places before. Yeah, well, just take the bit and trace the profile. Have you ever tried to trace a bit on the profile? You can't do it. It's silly. But if you are skilled in CAD or SketchUp or anything and you like using that, just draw the profiles out and kind of move them around. I'm not quite that good. So one thing I've done is created kind of a library of moldings. And I'm adding to this as things go along. So that's just my collection of moldings. I just started with plain old 1x4s from the lumberyard and cut them into the same length, and then spent an afternoon routing different moldings, routing different profiles using the bits that I had. Then I went to the table saw and cut these grooves that you see in them. That way, as you can see, it ties everything together, but it also serves another purpose, as you'll see here. Again, this is not an exhaustive set because there are more router bit profiles and sizes in the world. This could get pretty unwieldy if you do all that, or you build a second set. So here's my strategy for coming up with something different, unique, and custom to my particular project. I think, okay, let's just say at the base there's a flat base. want to transition up, and that's a concept to keep in mind. Moldings are about transitions. What you're doing is trying to guide the eye typically from something narrow to something wide or vice versa. So you've got a wider base that gives your cabinet a nice steady foundation, and then what you want to do is get the eye up smoothly to the narrower portion of the carcass, and that's where moldings come in. Those little curves, whether you're conscious of it or not, help guide your eye in a pleasant fashion from a wider area to a narrow area, or vice versa. So that first transition, we'll try, Cove. That's always a good one. Maybe a little, this is kind of a classic piece, so I want a little accent maybe. Put a little dental up there. Maybe a round over to top that off. Let's see how that looks. Then just get yourself a toilet bolt, a couple of toilet bolts, flat washers that come with them, and a wing nut. And that's where these slots come in handy now. So I can tie this all together and kind of maneuver those different profiles back and forth to see if there's something in there I like. That's where that flat head comes in nice because I can just rest it on the bench. Okay, loosen that a bit now, kind of align those. I want the dental right there, and we'll try that. So, let's just come around and see that. That's not too bad. That looks all right. I wonder what it looked like if, come up a little higher, Paul. A little over the top there. Yeah, I wonder if it looked like I have the round over as a cap on the dental. Oh, now I like that a little better. You may not your cabinet, is it? But this is what I'm trying to get to. I want you to be able to come up with some things that work for your cabinet, that please your eye. I am not a designer by trade or by talent, but I think we all know what we find pleasing to our eye. So trust your eye on that, especially if you're building something for yourself or for a loved one. Trust your own eye on it. If it's something you're going to look at every day, make sure it's something that you enjoy to look at. So try these little things, and don't worry about whether I'm hitting the golden proportion or am I getting this exactly right. Now, on the other side of that, as soon as I find something I like, I'm not going to head to the router and the table saw and start creating all these profiles on my lumber. I'm going to set this aside for a little while, and maybe a day, maybe just the afternoon, but then come back to it and look at it with a bit of a fresh eye. Say, does that still appeal to me? And in some cases, if you're at a stage in your build where maybe you've built the carcass or maybe mocked up the carcass, which is, by the way, in my other class I'm teaching, I hope you'll be in that. If you've mocked up the carcass and you have something you can set on top of your molding, now you can get even a better idea, how does this work as a whole? Do these moldings stand up to the cabinet as a whole? Does it maybe look too bulky? My cabinet's rather narrow, and I've got a big bulky thing on the bottom here now. So this becomes a interesting exercise, and you find something, but you're not quite sure. Take a photograph of it with your phone, make a record of it, then you can start swapping pieces back out, going, I wonder if I can improve on that, if I can find something else that I like better. What if I just take the round over and make it a little smaller? Yeah. That's not too bad. I like being able to look at the monitor too, because it kind of removes me from, gives me that step back to kind of assess the whole design. That seems to work pretty well too. So again, I'm going to make a judgment based on what I think is best for that particular project. Question?
When you were making up your stack,
yeah.
Depending on the height of the router bit to the table, you get different profiles.
Exactly.
How did you register your bits? Or did you just do the ones that you liked the way they looked?
Good question. So his question is, if you didn't hear it, is how did I determine the height of the bits when I was making these particular profiles? And it was just, catch as catch can. Now, I could have, because again, every bit has really an infinite number of profiles, I could have taken the half-inch round over bit, done the half-inch round over, dropped it a 16th, drop it an eighth, drop it, and try all those different combinations. So really what I did, to answer your question, is I just did the full profile. In the cases of the roundovers, I did not do them with a fillet, because I just wanted the round over profile. And one thing I don't have in here is any of the beads that we saw, that round over with the fillet at top and bottom. I don't have any of those profiles in my kit yet. Excuse me. That led me to a thought I wanted to answer. Maybe it'll come back to me. but a good question. So this is the kind of thing you can do to figure out what kind of molding you want to put together. And you'll notice on the end too, I've got them labeled. You can see how that comes in handy too, because I'm not sure, maybe at a glance, is that a 3/8 inch round over, is that a 1/4 inch round over? I don't have to go to the drawer, pull out the bit, match it to the profile, and figure out it's written right there, so I know exactly what my combination is going to be to put together that set of moldings. And if you're a little anal like I am, you can get them back in the right order. So everything's where it should be. That's round over. So one other thing I want to mention about this, when you're cutting these grooves here, set up the dado blade in the table saw. I'm using a piece of 1/4 inch all thread for that, so set up a 1/16 or whatever over, but cut profiles in each end at the same time. And here's the reason for that. Let's go back to our profile stack here. Let's grab a few at random. If you want to flip something over, oh, hey, look, I did add beads. I did find them. If you want to add something, I wonder what that looked like upside down. If I flip that profile, you can easily do that, and things stay aligned, because your slots are cut the same distance from each end. Okay, so those are some of the basic profiles you can create and work with on the router table quite easily. Give me just a moment here to reassemble this and get it out of the way. So far, we've got a drawer full of router bits and a whole bunch of profiles we can create. Most of what we've seen so far is good for the base of a cabinet. These are smaller type of moldings you would use at the base of a cabinet as it rises from the floor, maybe even as a belt line trim around the middle of a cabinet. And puts back. Great shot, Paul, thanks. So we left off with Cove Moldings on the router table. We want to mix and match profiles. We touched on that. Oh, yes, here's a good point. As you're putting together this stack, this is just one of those design rules. Gives you a guideline. Ignore it as you like. Again, if it looks good to you, use it. But this 15 and 40 degree gray area you see is about where you want those profiles to fall. So if you draw a line between the outermost point and the innermost point of your molding, 15 degrees to 40 degrees is a pretty good working range. And keep in mind that the smaller your molding, the closer you want to be to 15 degrees. The bigger your molding, you can work toward 40, closer to 40. You don't have to, but it looks more balanced. If you have small moldings that kind of get out there toward that 35, 40 degree range, they look like they're getting cantilevered and ready to fall over. Bigger moldings, not so much. So the smaller moldings, smaller lean angle, bigger moldings will accommodate a larger angle. That is the, so if you have, yeah, so if I have several of these that are projecting out, my outmost point down to the innermost point in that 15 degree to 40 degree area. I'm getting questions from the staff. Thank you. Cove molding at the top of a cabinet tends to be a little larger because you want that kind of ta-da finale as the eye works up a piece. It's just a nice cap on things. So cove moldings up there tend to be quite a bit bigger. This is the kind of stuff you can create, and this is where you can really get custom. You use the table saw to create these. And it's really kind of a simple process. Well, it's a little bit involved, but the process itself is not difficult. There's some setup involved, and you will need dust collection. There's no question you're going to need dust collection. It's kind of a lengthy process, and I'm not going to go through it, but I do happen to have a video. It's 12 minutes long, so in 12 minutes, you're going to learn how to make cove molding on the table saw. And I think you're going to like the instructor for this one, too. And would you believe you can make cove moldings like this, these type of curved cuts on your table saw? Not just cutting the cove molding off, but making the actual profile of the cove on your table saw. It's a neat trick you can learn real quickly. And first off, why would you want to do this? Well, the simple reason is you can make molding that matches your project perfectly. You buy the lumber for the molding, at the same time you make your own molding, and it blends very nicely with the finished project. The other thing is it gives you a lot of options. You can go from a narrow molding, such as this, even narrower, all the way up to a more medium, even a wider molding. This one's almost 3.5 inches wide across here. It gives you a lot of options to customize a project, make it exactly the way you want to make it. So how do you make these kind of curved cuts on the table saw, which you typically think of as making just straight cuts? Well, I'll show you. First thing to do is a little bit of setup on your table saw. You won't need the rip fence for this, you won't need your miter gauge, and if your saw has a riving knife, you'll need to remove that as well. For a blade, I recommend the higher tooth count, the better. The higher your tooth count, the smoother the cove is going to be, and the less sanding you'll have to do at the end of the process. I've got in here an 80 tooth crosscut blade, and this will give me a pretty smooth finish on the cove molding. Still going to be some sanding required, but not nearly as much as if I was using a 40 tooth combination blade or something similar. Now, the other thing you need to cut cove molding is a little jig. And what this jig is simply a little pivoting parallelogram. When you make this, it's really simple. Opposite sides of the same length, and drill these holes carefully so they're centered on the width, and assemble this carefully so that as you pivot the jig, the sides always stay parallel. It's, again, pretty simple to make. The reason for this jig is you're going to take the dimensions of your cove. Now, the example we used for the magazine article, we had a cove that was 3 3/8 of an inch wide. That means this measure across here, from this point to this point, was 3 3/8 inch. So I'm going to take my jig and set the arms 3 3/8 inch apart, and then twist the lock nut, the wing nuts here, to lock it at that width. Next, I want to lower the blade and then raise it to the height of my final cut. That would be the depth of the cove from this point to the bottom of the cove. In the profile I want, that's a 1/2 inch. So we need to set the blade 1/2 inch above the table. You want to measure carefully. Make sure you're measuring the highest point on the blade. Okay. Next, a piece of masking tape here. Put a piece right in the front of where the blade just falls below the tabletop. So it just kisses that painter's tape. Right there. And do I need to mention we're doing all this with the saw unplugged? Now the same at the back. Wherever that tooth comes above the table, that's where the edge of the tape should be. Next, I'm going to make a couple marks. One, where that front tooth comes down and where the back tooth comes up. Now that I've got these marks made on the blade, I'm going to lower the blade completely below the table. These marks are going to help me position my jig. Simply pivot the jig until the inside edges of the jig align with those marks. And at that point, I'm going to make a mark right along the inside edge of this fence here. Okay, with that mark made, I can take the jig off. I'm done with that. You're going to need 2 straight pieces of scrap, have a straight edge and pretty much square to the face. It's not critical that they be perfectly square, but these are the 2 fences that are going to guide the piece across the table saw as we make the cut. Just take a piece of scrap about 3/4 inch thick.
This measurement, again, is not real critical. 1/2 inch is fine, but 3/4 seems like you have plenty of that laying around. Just using that as a spacer along the mark. And I'm going to align the fence 3/4 of an inch from that mark. And I'll clamp it down.
Okay, good question. So he's asking about the marks on the tape, why they're on those particular sides of the blade. So what you're looking for there is the point of first contact as the board comes in and the point of last contact as it exits, because that defines your cut.
One thing to be clear about, and to make sure you do, this happened to me the first few times I did this on the table saw, make sure your clamps are outside this face. You need a clear path for your workpiece to pass through. So there's my first fence in place. To position the second one, I'm going to use the actual workpiece in which I'm going to cut the cove molding. Just place it against that first fence. This is the jointed edge here. And position the second fence. And I can see I've got a little too snug down at that end. It won't pass through, so I need to adjust my fences. There, I've got a good sliding fit. I'm going to peel this masking tape up off there. I don't need it anymore. I'm just about ready to start making cuts. Again, as you know, this piece is going to slide through here. Want to make sure, since the blade is going to be hidden during this cut, I'm not pushing with my thumb back here. I've got a push block that's got a nice heel on it that I can hook over the back edge here and push the piece through. Now you're making a cut here that the blade really isn't designed to make. You're pushing kind of sideways into it, so you want to make very light cuts, very shallow cuts, no more than about 1/16 of an inch on a pass. So there's my first pass. Teeth are just barely above the table. This process makes a lot of dust, even if you use a dust collector. A dust mask or a respirator is a good idea. That's not smoke coming out the end. That's just fine dust. I've raised the blade another 1/16 of an inch for the next pass. Raise the blade slightly between each pass. To cut this cove, I took 12 passes. Okay, so there it is. My nice wide cove molding, 3 3/8 wide, 1/2 inch in depth. Now there is still, if you're able to feel this, you'd be able to feel it still needs some sanding before it's ready to go. Sanding a curved surface like that can be a little tricky, but you can make a custom sanding block using just some of this pink foam that you can find at the home center. Easy thing to do is just put it next to your cove molding you just created and trace that. Then just use a coping saw, or you can take it to the bandsaw and just kind of rough cut close to that line as best you can. If you take some self-adhesive sandpaper, lay it into the cove molding you just cut. Now take the rough sanding block and just run it back and forth. Shape that block. Now that profile matches the cove perfectly. Peel that off there. Put some fresh sandpaper on the bottom of my block, and I can start sanding. Okay, I've got the rip fence back on the saw. I've swapped out my blade for a combination blade here, and I've also installed a new zero clearance insert that allows me to tilt the blade to 45 degrees. On the end of my cove blank, I've laid out the final profile. I've got to make 4 bevel cuts now, bevel rips, to bring the cove molding to final shape. And that's simply a matter of taking your marks, aligning them with the tooth on the blade, and then bringing the rip fence up to that. So there's the final profile, and then when you're ready to put it on top of your cabinet, it'll sit about like that. Now, I've just made one single piece of molding here. One tip I can give you is when you're making molding for a cabinet, don't measure and make just enough. Make at least one piece more than you think you're going to need, because it's much better to have one extra piece than to end up a little bit short and try to duplicate a setup, because you'll never get it exactly the same. So make yourself a little bit extra as you're making this cove molding. Now that you know how to make basic cove molding, let's get trickier. To make a cove like this that leans to one side, just tilt the blade. Here I've tilted the blade to 45 degrees, and I'm feeding at about a 10-degree angle. And you've probably noticed the fences are positioned differently. Here's why. When the blade is straight up and down, you can feed from either direction, it doesn't matter. But when you tilt the blade, you need to feed into the rotation of the blade. That simply means if your blade tilts to the left, like this one, feed from left to right. If your blade tilts to the right, feed from right to left. Here on the final pass, you can really see the shape of the cove. As you see, you can play around with the feed angle, with the blade angle, and all kinds of things to come up with a variety of coves. Have fun, experiment with it, and once you get a piece like this cut, it's a good idea to write on it the settings you had on the blade, whether the feed angle, the blade height, and the blade tilt. That way you can build a library of cove moldings and have one that's right for your next project.
I like that guy. So that's kind of the way to do cove molding. Now, one thing we saw in there was doing that 45-degree bevel. So after we've got the cove shaped, we're making those intersecting 45-degree bevels. That's not a fixed angle either. So that for that particular project, this was made for a particular project in the magazine. 45 was the angle we used on that, so that's what was demonstrated in the video. You can make that whatever angle you like to get a different projection. Again, going back to that 1540 angle. So if you want to lean out a little farther, just make the angle a little more severe. If you want to stand up a little more upright, make it a little less severe. Oh, by the way, that video is online on our website. If you want a refresher course on it, woodmagazine.com/tscove. I think that's probably in your notes, toward the end of your notes. So if you want to look at that again. And the article that accompanied it, did I include the article? I don't think I included the actual article, but it's certainly on the thumb drive. And it's referenced in your notes, issue 198, like the video said. But that'll give you the written instructions that go with the video and some of the illustrations that we had as well. Oops. Okay, so we've kind of got the mechanics down on making all these various profiles. We kind of understand how we can combine them. We can make a big cove. We can make all these routed coves. How do you go about creating an appealing profile? Now, earlier I said trust your eye, and that's fine. But you don't have to just come up with things in your brain. There's a world full of beautiful, attractive moldings out there. So look for inspiration all around you. What kind of places? Well, other cabinetry. We're building cabinetry. Look at other cabinets you like. If you're in someone's home, or you're in a museum, or you see something in a magazine, and you see a molding you like, make a note of it, and we'll talk about some strategies you can use for that. Cabinet buildings, especially the neoclassical buildings, those built in the late 19th, early 20th century, have the big pediments and moldings on them, so look at those. Architectural moldings inside of houses. Again, going back to the late 19th century, early 20th century, moldings were a bigger part of how homes were put together. So you can look around a mantelpiece, over doors, cove moldings, picture rail moldings, all have intricate and different profiles. So look at those, kind of study them, see if there's something that, if it caught your eye the first time, there must be something there. So again, trust your eye on that kind of thing. Books, okay? And, oh yeah, the internet image search, cabinet moldings, architectural moldings, all these things. You'll come up with scads of inspiration. So you find a molding you like. You like this profile. How do you go about making this intricate profile? It's a simple matter of breaking it down. So you take it and you break it down into elements that fit those that we saw earlier that you can make with your router table. Or maybe you're going to have to go out and buy a particular bit for something. So looking at this one from top to bottom. Up here at the top, what's that? That's an Ogee. Right in there, what do we got there? There's a small cove, and it's got a fillet on it. So there's a cove with a fillet. That one's pretty simple. There's just a flat area. Right below that, another flat area. This is pretty simple, isn't it? There's nothing really complicated about this particular design, but what you're picking up is how they were assembled. So these are all shapes you can make. You're just picking up how you're going to assemble them. Now down here on the down here on the bottom, we've got a cove, but notice where that line is, where I've kind of divided that. That's not really in the right place, because if I was making this molding and I routed this cove, I'd have this tiny little fragile edge, wouldn't I? That's not a good thing. So what I would do is I would put a fillet on it, kind of like this one up here, and then blend it so that fillet and that flat area there meet. So that's a bit of a practical consideration. You don't just want to cut a piece that has a fragile edge that is going to be prone to chip out or breaking when you go to assemble it. So here I would move that bottom line up 1/16, 1/8 of an inch, whatever, so I have a fillet there. So let's look at some other moldings and kind of break them down using that. This is the Cove molding we saw earlier when I started talking about table saw. So up at top, there's our Cove molding. We'll just kind of work our way down here. We got a shadow here, and what I've got there, it looks like a kind of an asymmetrical bead. I'm going to guess if this was 3/4 inches thick. We've got a 1/2 inch round over on the bottom and maybe a 1/4 inch round over on top, possibly a 3/8, or it even could be that 1/2 inch bit again, just lowered in the router table, so it's cutting a partial profile. Below that, we got another fillet that could be probably attached to this molding. If I'm making this at home, looks like I'm going to have a small bead there. Looks like a 1/4 inch piece with 1/8 inch round over on each edge. Same thing right below it, so I've got kind of a double bead. So I've made two 1/4 inch thick beads and stacked them up. Below that, there's a flat area. Then I got my double bead again. And you probably could go out and find a double bead profile bit to do this in one pass. Your choice if you want to spend that for a very specialty bit, how often you're going to use it. And then of course this is all set on top of the cabinet, and it stands proud to give us a nice shadow line. That's something to be aware of that you're trying to create. Shadows create interest and they break up things. As again, as your eye is traversing top to bottom or bottom to top, it's good to give your eye a little bit of a break. Sometimes you want just a continuous flow, like in an Ogee or just a cove. And other times you want to just have a little bit of a break there. I can't tell you when. Again, trust your eye to look at that. Here's another cabinet, and this one's a little bit fuzzy. I apologize for it, but I liked the look of it, and I think we can still break it down. So at the top, again, we've got a little, I'm going to guess that's one of those asymmetrical coves, kind of like we saw earlier. But this I like because it's not a cove, a traditional cove. It's simply a flat piece, either beveled or set at an angle. So it's either beveled on the edge so it tilts out, or it's beveled along the face so that it tilts out. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a curve that's doing that crown. Below that, another round over. Here we've got a cove with a shoulder, flat, and then we've got a cove here that's just a little smaller than that one. Then it rests on top of the cabinet. This one, that's perfectly acceptable. We talked a lot about curves and things. This one's rectilinear. This is just flat boards with rounded edges to kind of ease the appearance a little bit, make it look a little less harsh. And we've stacked up those flat boards on top of each other, staggering their offset and varying the thickness. That's where the interest comes from with this one. So we've got kind of the star of the show there in the middle with your thicker molding there, slightly thinner piece on top, and then a thin piece below. And then, of course, supported down below. Here's the architectural molding. Get inside some of these 19th century homes, you get these elaborate moldings. Here you've got two examples from which you could get inspiration. All kinds of things going on up here at the Cove. You know, we've talked about cabinetry so far, but you could certainly use this Cove molding method to make a crown molding for your house. That was a little difficult to dissect from this angle, so let's just go down to what's above the door here. I think, gosh, you've got 2 cabinets worth of stuff here. You got your dental molding, you can see that, crown moldings. We got, it looks like a Cove there, another Cove making the transition there. But again, you can kind of see that angle. This one's a little bit more severe. It's a bigger Cove molding like I referenced, so they can get away with a little bit steeper angle. And notice that this angle looks very, very close. I can't vouch for it being the same, but it looks very, very close to this. If you're going to stack moldings, I think that's something you'd try to do is keep them very similar. This is an image search from Google and just an old frieze from a building, but I like this because it gives you a cross section. Here's why, you know, an image search has done most of the work for me, hasn't it? It gives me the cross section of all these different molding profiles, and I can actually probably even measure the thickness of these pieces to help me come up with the balance that will match the image I found here. This one, I am just fascinated by this one. This is simply a Roman Ogee routed on the edge of a piece, and then it's turned on edge, and the dental molding I cut earlier, that's what's happened here. Just that it's cut a little bit deeper. Cut just above, again, I'm pointing here, it's cut, so this is cut just a little bit above the shoulder of the Ogee. When I first saw this, I just loved the shape of this. And again, going back to inspiration, this appeals to me. I went home and I said, how do they do that? How do they do that? I look at, well, it's like as simple as I just described. So I cut it, and just a piece of scrap sitting around the house, I go, I'm going to have to find a cabinet to put this on now. So now I've got a project where I'm going to have to design something that will be suitable for this particular piece of molding.
Okay.
Yes, question?
In that example, the data blades have a little fiber cutter on the outer.
Some of them, yeah, most of them do, yeah.
Would that kind of be visible in this situation?
It probably would. You know, my sample at home, I didn't look at that closely. I was just, oh, it's so cool. But, you know, I may have to look at that a little closer, see if those little ears are discernible. And if they are, how I would clean that up. There is is it Freud makes the blade with the box joint blade? That's Freud, isn't it? Yeah, they make a box joint blade that cuts clean shoulders. So there's that option. Here's another image search that brought up that cross section, and like I mentioned earlier, this drawing does the bulk of the work for me. I can find all these little profiles in my router bit set or make these on the table saw, and it also gives me an idea how to stack them up. So I can stack up 3 flat pieces and then kind of cap each one with its own profile. Here's an example of a building. This one I think is a Virginia government building, if I remember the search right. But again, there may be a couple cabinets worth of molding here. I don't think I'd go as far as the balustrade with the turned spindles and things up top. Maybe you would. I wouldn't. Maybe you would. But and the lion's heads, I'm not going to carve those things. But there's a nice Cove molding that the lion's heads are rested in. We've got dental molding down here. So, you know, it's kind of closer to that 2-to-1 ratio we talked about. And you got a nice flat here. This is really kind of, I mean, if you ignore the lion's heads on up, this is really kind of subdued. There's not much interest to it. The dental kind of is where your eye goes on that. Again, if you're ruling out that railing at the top. And this one, you really have to look through all that carving to find the profiles. But again, here's just a slanted piece, flat. Looks like you got a small cove in there. This is just one of those stretched out Ogees, those bits I've talked about where the arc is a little more elongated. It's not perfectly circular. Another Ogee there, dental molding, and on down we go. So even looking at something like that, your first initial impression might be, oh, that's way too ornate. But you start stripping things down, looking at what's really there, you might find something that inspires you. So this has all been great theory, right, so far? Well, at least I think it has been. Let's talk about a real-world example. Finding inspiration and then doing something with it. This is an entryway door to my house. I was building a bookcase. I had a plan that I was working from. That it was kind of a tall bookcase. It's as tall as a door, 74 inches. And then there was a pediment on top of that, a little too ornate for my tastes and for our home, so I wanted to do something different on it. I wasn't quite sure what it was I wanted to do. So I'm scratching my head, and like I said, I'm not a designer, but I'm trying to sketch things on paper and, not getting anything that really appeals to me. During one of my breaks in my head scratching sessions, I just happened to glance above the entry door that was over my shoulder, and I saw the moldings up there. I thought, huh. And that was the moment I thought, I think I could probably do something similar to that. And I do two things. Number one, I've got an okay inspiration here. I hope I improved on it. But number two, it'll actually help tie my piece into my house. So let's dissect what we've got here. Got a flat piece here with a small cove. Then we got kind of an Ogee molding here. This is store-bought stuff, came from Menards. Then there's a dental below that. Got another Ogee, flat, and going. And here's something that this is one of the reasons this triggered my inspiration. This flat and this piece here and the fluted columns look a lot like my bookcase. So this is the actual molding I came up with. So you can see there's the fluted column. You can see a little bit of similarity there, but you can see why I think my subconscious said, oh, there's part of your bookcase already in the house. Why don't you adapt that? So what I did was I didn't really like, on the existing stuff, I didn't like how far this projected. This looks like they just missed it. They just went too far. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to do that. But I do like the cove. I like the dental. And I like the little bit of cove below that to kind of transition into the top of the cabinet. Cove, making that small cove on the bottom, that was no big deal. That's a router bit. Making the dental molding, as we've seen, that's easy to do. So the real question mark was, what was this cove going to look like? So I went through the process that we saw in that video. I just had short segments of scrap stock, really, and working with 2x6s, and I just set up different approaches on the table saw, different angles, tried some asymmetrical, like we described there, tried some wider, tried some narrower, and after about a half dozen times, I either got tired or I found one. I can't just remember which it was. But I found enough that what I'd done is, let's switch over to you, Paul. So I had just, again, a small section of the cove, small section of the dental, and then as I would make these experimental pieces of cove, I'd miter the section, hot glue it to the top of this, and since my cabinet was in progress, I could take it and set it right on top of the cabinet and look at it from two sides. And I could step back and do the same thing. Most importantly, I could call my wife out. What do you think, honey? Okay, so that one's out. And then go back to the table saw and try something else. So I eventually found this one. I decided instead of that flat piece on the top, I would just incorporate that flat right into the cove, and that way it didn't have that extension out there. And as I cut this to size, it just seemed like a boring flat piece up there, so I just routed a shallow groove in there. Again, a bit of a shadow line, kind of breaks up that flat, adds a little bit of visual interest, at least in my book. Yeah, question?
Silly question. I've never used Cove Molding before. Is that a compound angle?
It is a compound angle, and we'll touch on that here in a bit too. Yeah. So, like I said, I was making various types of cove molding. So as I was working, I was also making notes on it. So you can see this one was 15-degree tilt on my table saw, so it's an asymmetrical cove. I noted that this is just a V groove bit. I'm not sure I had to do that. But then I also made notes that I beveled this bottom at 17 degrees to get that lean that I wanted. Again, it didn't have to be the 45 we saw in the video. I started it was flat first, and I didn't like the way it stood up, so I just started chopping away a little bit until I found an angle that I liked. And then the top is also mitered at 17 degrees so that it just kind of continues on up and out. So here's the bookcase, and let's put the two side by side. You can kind of see inspiration and my interpretation of that. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Doesn't that look great on my screen? that look a lot better once that goes away. So again, inspiration and my interpretation of it. And most importantly, the wife is pleased. There was a question. Somebody have a hand up? Do you have a question? Oh, the screen. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so that kind of covers the cabinet moldings portion of our program today. Any questions before we move on into picture frames? Yeah.
Maybe a silly question, but do you assemble them with wood with it up, or you put up piece by piece?
Well, that's a good question. He's asking if I assembled that piece by piece, or if I did. I think I did it piece by piece on the frame. My typical method of work, and I'm probably what I did here, was assemble the front, because you've got to miter those two corners to match the desired width. Then I can miter the sides and then just cross-cut them easily to get the width on, or the length on the back. So I'm sure that's probably the approach I took.
Second question, how do you put it up? It's kind of a regular shape. You look like, right?
I'm sorry. Okay.
How do you pull it up? All these pieces, all these profiles.
Okay, that's, and actually you're right, I almost forgot that, and someone had asked about mitering moldings. If you're making your own moldings, you're making what's your own spring angle, and that's the angle at which this springs from the wall. Excuse me. To miter these, you'll do what's called the upside down and backwards method. You'll put it in place, then you'll take it to the saw and put the cove down. We have a video online that explains this much better than I'm probably in. Woodmagazine.com/molding video. Again, it should be in your notes. But you're going to miter this so it leans against the fence of the miter saw, and then you'll bevel the miter saw, or rotate the miter saw to the 45-degree angle. Then with one cut, you'll come up with the angle you need. So the compound is that you're leaning it against the fence and the table. That's, yeah. So you'll put what would be the top is on the table, what would be the bottom is on the fence. And Bob Hunter did a video on this, give you the visuals on it at that URL I gave you, molding /molding video. So that'll walk you through that. Other questions? I'd like to.
Where do you find room to keep all this practice stuff in?
My garage looks much better now. It's been a little cluttered mess. Let's talk about picture frames. I'm going to show you a bunch of different picture frames. When I started putting this program together, my initial thought was, well, we've got a lot of picture frames that we did in the magazine, and we've got a lot of moldings that we've done in the magazine. These are a few samples here. This is all on that thumb drive, by the way, that you got in your swag bag, so you can go find all these later. Just search for frames. There's a terrific searchable index that's included on that USB. So this was one article. You can kind of see here, just kind of get a mental picture of some of this, because we're going to see variations on some of this. Was another great article. I thought this is kind of cool. I can do some of these. And there's this one. So there's a variety of frames already in the magazine. So as I started, I thought, well, why should I teach you stuff that you're already going to have the directions to? So what I did was I started riffing off of those frames. I started looking at them going, okay, the idea is to teach you to come up with your own stuff, right? And not just work from a plan, but use your imagination. So that's what I started doing, was using my imagination. I used those 3 articles I just showed you as kind of a basis, and you'll see some variations on those, and you'll see some stuff I just came up with on my own as I was working. We'll try to work through these in I don't know if it's in necessarily increasing order of complexity, but we're going to start with some pretty simple stuff. So I think in your instructions or your handout, you've got the basics on the instructions for all this, what size bits are used and how we put them together. But we'll talk through them. If you guys have any questions as we go, I'll try to answer those. So our first one, and this was actually the first one I did, and I did such a great job on it, you can't even see the joint line. I could not be prouder of a glue up. This is 2 pieces of wood. These are all 3/4 inch thick. That's one thing I tried to limit myself to as I was preparing this. I didn't want to get real exotic. Okay, this one's 5/8 and this one's 9/16 and this one's 1.5 inches. I tried to keep everything at 3/4 of an inch. Few variations here and there, but by and large, if you got 3/4 inch stock, you can make these frames. So this one, we started with outside piece of oak. It's 3/4 inches by 1 inch wide, rounded over the edges, and then routed a shallow rabbet. See where my arrow's going there? That's the joint line. That's the rabbet right there. Nice joint, huh? Huh? Yeah. So, and then we've got this other piece here. What's that? 3/4 by 1 also, rounded over one edge, then glued the square edge into there. So why the rabbet? Why not just glue them together? Rabbet helps register one piece against the other. And that's something to keep in mind as you're making moldings for frames. Consistency is your friend. If you're setting up to make a cut on the router table or on the table saw, use feather boards. Even if you're, I can push that across there. The time you take to set up feather boards on the router table, you'd set it up above and beside the bit to make sure you've got consistent pressure down and against the fence. And on the table saw, again, depending on the cut, same orientation, but you wouldn't press against the side of the blade. You'd press up in front of the blade before it makes contact. But the idea is to get that consistent because you're going to be mitering these pieces, and if they're inconsistent where that joint, if there's variations of thickness, that's where you'll see it, is at the joint. And invariably, you'll miter where things are different. So as you're working, make sure you keep things consistent. The other thing to keep in mind as you're designing frames is the rabbet. You got to make sure you keep enough meat in that inside piece that you can cut a rabbet here to accept the artwork. And you can put often a piece of glass in there, then you'll put your photo or artwork, and then you'll back it up with a piece of cardboard or some hardboard or something to keep it flat, and then put however you're going to hold that in there, turn buttons or whatever. So you have to accommodate that for that rabbet. You don't want to leave a sliver of material here. The size of that rabbet will typically, guideline again, 3/8 by 3/8 is a good size for that. It's going to vary depending on your piece. If you have something that has 3 or 4 layers of mat, you're going to have to go a little bit deeper, right? Because it's going to be that much thicker. If you have just a photograph and it's going to have a piece of 1/8 inch glass photo and a piece of cardboard, then that 3/8 by 3/8 rabbet is probably going to be sufficient, maybe even a little bit too deep. Okay, one other tip on making your moldings. Say you're making an 8 by 10 frame, you need 10 times 2, 8 times 2, so that'd be 20, 30, you need 36 inches of material? Did I do that math right? Yeah, 30, no, you need about 1.5 times that. Always make 2 pieces of molding, extra pieces of molding, that are at least as long as your longest piece. Again, just covering your butt. Because as you're setting up to make moldings, this goes back to being consistent. If you screw something up when you're if you cut just enough and you screw up a piece, now you have to go back, duplicate your setups, and they're not going to be exact. So the new piece will not fit as well with the old pieces. So do yourself a favor. It seems like it might be a little bit of a waste, but you'll thank yourself at some point by having that extra piece of molding sitting there on the bench that you can go to because you cut one too short or something chipped out or whatever. So make yourself some extra molding. Yes, question?
Do you prefer to do longer runs and then cut them, or approximately?
Good question. So his question is, do I prefer to make pieces that are about as long as my finished pieces, or work on one long piece of stock and then chop shorter pieces from it? It depends. And you'll find that's my answer to a lot of questions. But here's when I would choose one over the other. If I have a small frame, I'd probably go with the longer stock because it's easier to work with something that say it's 24 inches long or maybe 36, and as opposed to something that might be 6 inches long, trying to route pieces like that. So in that case, for a smaller frame, I'd try to route profiles. Maybe I'd do like a length where I could get 2 pieces out of it, and then I would chop them up. If I had a large frame, and I have a good example of this, I made mirrors for my master bathroom at home, and they're quite large. They're 2 feet by probably 4 feet. So in that case, yeah, there was no way that was a good point where I just cut them about 6 inches over length, give myself a little bit of arrow room, and routed those profiles before I put those together. Talked about consistency. Also, before you go to assembly your pieces, do all your finish sanding. Goes back to the consistency thing, but also think about these two pieces here. You're not going to have much success sanding right where that round over meets that piece if you do it after the glue up. So when the pieces are separate, do all your sanding then. You'll have your final fit, and then put things together. Go easy on the glue, too. We're not building furniture here that's going to be drug across the floor or has to support Aunt Sarah, are we? We are simply making a frame that's going to hang on the wall. Now, as these frames get bigger, like those mirrors I described, glue becomes a little more in alternate joinery methods. We'll talk about that a bit, too. But by and large, when you're assembling moldings like I'm talking about here, building things up, just a narrow strip of glue is all you're going to need. Don't think like you're gluing up a panel where you want those beads of squeeze out to indicate you've got enough glue. If you've got squeeze out on a frame, you're overdoing it, because you're going to have to clean that stuff up. And frames are things that get analyzed pretty closely, aren't they? People go up and look at what's in that frame, and they're looking pretty closely at that frame. It's probably one of those things you'll do next to boxes that'll get very closely scrutinized. You get away with a bit of squeeze out on a cabinet, in the lower corner of a door or inside a drawer or something, but on a frame it's going to pop out. So don't overdo the glue. All right. So questions on this one, how this one's assembled? Pretty simple, right? Okay. Let's look at this next one. So I'm kind of taking you through my build process too. Hopefully we can talk about how I inspire some of this. Actually, I could start passing these around, I guess, since you guys can actually take a look and feel what they look like. You get a little different sense sometimes. Next one is our maple with walnut edging. So I got this one done. It's pretty simple. I thought, what else can I do that's really simple but a little more striking? So I went to just a flat piece of maple and trimmed it with walnut on each edge. I like the contrast of that. So to make the walnut, I actually did plane down material here. I had a wider piece. So this is an inch, I believe, on the walnut. That's 3/4. So here I've got 9/16 maple. So here's where I cheated a little bit. And I've got 3/4 walnut, rounded over the edge, ripped off a piece, rounded over the edge, ripped off a piece. So I'm starting with a wider blank here. So again, I'm not starting with that finish. It's much safer to work on a much wider blank. So round it over a piece and rip off. Then glue them in place, and after it's all assembled, come back and cut the rabbet for this piece. The idea here is think about contrasting species. That's a great way to come up with visual interest. Maple, walnut, look around the hardwood store while you're there, see what catches your eye. Let's see, next one is, I'm going to start passing that one around. Hopefully this will get to you guys in the back before we're too deep into it. Yeah, question? Back up one slide. Yes, I can. Yes. Is there a secret to not getting a little bead at the top? So what you're asking is avoiding getting a ridge right down there where the two roundovers meet? Yeah, how to avoid that? Carefully setting your fence. And frankly, a little sandpaper after the fact. Truly. You can minimize it, and if you're lucky, you'll get that perfect setting, and you have zero run out on your router, and it doesn't settle a little bit in the table. I'm not that lucky, so I do the best I can setting that round over, setting the height, and sometimes even you'll see it kind of hits and skips. Have some places where it was perfect and some places where it wasn't, so little sandpaper takes care of that. And I mean, if we hadn't had this talk, would you have guessed that I'd sanded that to get that? Or would you have guessed that was a round over? Or are you just looking at it going, that's a pretty nice round over. So, okay, this one, I like the contrast of the maple and the walnut. I started thinking, okay, what other ways can I make contrast? I thought, well, I could paint something and then tear away some of the paint. So that's all this is. Started with a piece of cherry and spray painted the entire top. In this case, I just used black enamel paint. Enamel, you got to let dry thoroughly because it stays kind of soft. Give it whatever the can says, 24, 48 hours, whatever it says. give it the full time to dry because otherwise it'll stick to your fingers, it'll tear. So I got this all painted black. And then when it came time to route these roundovers, we got a roundover with a fillet there, smaller roundover with a fillet on the inside. So this is going to be resting on my router table and going across that surface. Like I just said, I don't want to mess up that paint that I just applied. So what I did was taped wax paper to it. Just wrapped it in waxed paper, taped it on the back side here. And then as I'm running that piece across the router table, the wax paper's taken the abuse. Certainly no problem for a router bit to get through the wax paper. It got torn away, sucked up in the dust collector, and my piece came out with the paint intact. So after doing the 2 roundovers, I set up the table saw and cut a kerf that's just kind of centered on the remaining black field. So it just took a little bit of measuring to figure out, it's not centered on the width of the piece, it's centered on the width of that remaining black field. So just got a little bit of measuring set up there. Then also, you can probably see that that's fine, Paul. You can see a little black edge left there. So as I set up the router table, I wanted to make sure I left a little black edge there. So as you're looking at the frame from the side, again, just gives a little bit of interest. Kind of makes it look a little bit lighter than it really is too. So on with the contrasting species theme. I had a lot of mahogany and the maple that I had worked out pretty nicely. This was a very simple profile. You can even see, here's why you cut extra. Look at that. You got Cove, and I chose to photograph this. I should have cut that off. I didn't even notice it until I got the photos back. I'm like, oh, well, it is what it is. So no Photoshop here for you guys, just honest. But it's simple coves on 3 of the edges, and then a kerf plowed down the middle to insert that maple piece. And here, I wanted to also experiment a little bit like I did with the maple and walnut piece on things in different planes. So here we've got that maple inset into a saw kerf. One of the tricks with this is getting a good match between the insert piece and that kerf. So I got lucky, frankly. I just ripped the maple off the edge of a blank and managed to hit it pretty close. I think a better strategy is rip it just a hair wide and then take like a block plane and put just the slightest chamfer on one edge of it. What you're doing essentially is making it a little bit wedge shaped. That way you can seat it down in there, and it will seat in that kerf, and you won't have any gaps where the two meet. Here there's a risk of a gap showing somewhere along here, especially after I sand this piece. So I would recommend that strategy with the block plane. You're probably not going to, if you're not overly aggressive with it, a couple of passes is really all you're going to need. If you're not removing too much material, you won't end up with part of it sitting a little deeper and part of it standing a little prouder. You should end up with a pretty consistent look. And if you get anybody that's taking your picture frames and sighting down them like that, take your picture frame and tell them to leave. So that's the mahogany and maple. The sample, you guys have seen these samples, it kind of helps, doesn't it, to see the picture frame and actually get an idea what the scale is as opposed to just the pictures. Yeah, question? The presentations? These individual photographs, or the photographs are in your handout. What you'll have is a copy of the handout. And in fact, off on a tangent here, the handouts for every class are on that thumb drive. So even if you can't get it depends on what the teacher provided us. Some of, like this one that I've done is, I think it's in color on the thumb drive. Do you remember, Lucas? I think I made a color PDF. But is there any color in your handouts? I haven't seen the handouts. They're all black and white. I think that my presentation, this particular one, does have a color PDF on the thumb drive. And that's the reason I did it. I think is what you want to know is seeing those contrasts, right? Yeah. We'll talk about that too.
In the math class?
We'll talk about that too. They're talking about my joint reinforcement that is showing on the back. And this is again, if somebody's looking at my frames that close at home, I'd ask you to leave. Taking the pictures out of my frames to check the joinery. What are you, some kind of woodworker? Okay, so we had maple with a mahogany accent. Let's kind of reverse that and see what we can do. This one was, I'll be frank with you, with a little bit of a happy accident. I had the maple, made the cove on the interior. I like that cove because it kind of transitions your eye down into whatever's being displayed there. The piece that's proud, I wanted to do a bead because, like I talked about earlier from the previous one that had the little maple strip there, I wanted to make sure I didn't have any gaps on this one. So I thought, well, here's a strategy for making sure you don't see any gaps. I'll make the piece that goes into the gap, into the kerf, a little wider, and I'll have shoulders that'll cover any gap. So this is simply a roundover. Now, I didn't do this with a beading bit like I talked about originally. This was a roundover bit with a fillet. And my intention was to make a perfectly round profile here. What happened was either I set the bit or it slipped or something. But I ended up with this Gothic peak, which actually I like better. It kind of looked pretty cool. I wish I'd have saved this setup and made more molding like I talked about, because I'd love to recreate this sometime. It can be done easily, but again, it wasn't my intent, but it's how it came out, and I liked it well enough. I thought, well, that's my new design. So here again, the idea I wanted to get across, besides being fortuitous with your accidents, is being able to hide that gap by figuring out how you might have a small shoulder or a narrower piece below that will hide any gap and any squeeze out that might come through too. Yes?
Yeah, do you ever use a shaper to cut any of these shapes? Because you could do a complete.
He's asking if I ever use a shaper. I don't own a shaper. I don't have room for one. No, I never have. If you have a shaper, yeah, bully for you. Grind a knife to match exactly what you want and do it in one pass. Yeah. Okay. So I guess the other thing I want to mention on making that mahogany accent piece here, I did those roundovers on opposite faces. So I'm working on, again, a wider blank, something that's about, say, 3 or 4 inches wide. I've rounded over the edges, got my shoulders there. Then I took it to the table saw and cut shallow kerfs there to make these shoulders. So those are table saw kerfs, and I've still got material, obviously, along here. And then I raised the blade to cut it free. So that was my procedure on making that. Okay, so there's that one going around. By the way, if you're wondering, these have all been finished with lacquer, just a spray lacquer, rattle can lacquer. That's how I finished all these. And the reason I mention that now is because this next one, I'm really dissatisfied with what lacquer did to it. It did not do what I hoped. But let's talk about the frame first. Again, a little bit of contrast, but I decided I wanted to get a little fancier, get something a little more formal. And I'd had some of this walnut burl veneer, not a big piece, just, small piece sitting around. I thought, I wonder if I can do something with that. So I laminated the veneer onto an MDF substrate. Then obviously MDF doesn't have very pretty edges, so you got to cover it with something. And so I ripped off a thin maple strip to go on the outside, and then did my bead profile here and ripped that free from my wider blank, and then glued that on the other opposite side so everything is flush on the top. Now my hope was that when I applied the lacquer, I'll pop it over here to you, Paul, so they can see this up close. I was hoping when I applied the lacquer that that grain would pop, but it went to hell. I was disappointed. But frankly, I was kind of deep into this and didn't have time to sand it down and hit it with an oil or something, see how that might treat it. But the lesson to learn here is a little experimentation ahead of time pointed to a problem that I would have had finishing this. I would not make a whole frame. This is a good idea. Save some scrap, try your finish on it, find out if the finish is going to work before you attack the entire frame. Okay. So even failures can serve as examples. Look at me. So more veneer. So I had this piece of MDF with my nice walnut burl veneer. Still had some strips left over after making that sample. Thought, all right, let's take it up a little bit. So I decided to make what I considered kind of a Victorian looking frame. So this is that MDF. I've got it sandwiched between two pieces of cherry. It was a thicker cherry. That one was, what, 1.25 inches, or 13/16 thick. And I think the only reason for the extra 1/16 there is because I stopped planing a little too early. I think I mismeasured, so it's not intentionally 13/16. But what it did give me is, I think, just a little bit more of that field there, which is fine. It worked out fine. So this could be 3/4. You have just a little bit narrower field there. So identical pieces on either side. Kind of gave me a nice depth on it that we kind of haven't seen yet in any of the other samples that have come around. So same thing with that veneer. You'll see the lacquer did it no favors whatsoever. So I did this kind of, I don't know, I'm not really Victorian, but a little more Victorian type of look, and I thought I need something modern to kind of balance out the portfolio here. Something not too embellished. So I decided, well, I haven't done anything. I've done contrast. It's really visible from the sides and things. Had the oak and the maple here, so I laminated some pieces of oak and maple, and then just chamfered the inside here so that the chamfer ends right where the maple and the oak interior meet there. And then went over the router table, and my question here on doing this one was, I wonder if using a Cove or a core box bit, which has a rounded profile on the end, instead of a straight bit, I wonder if that shadow will look any different, if it might have like a smoother transition instead of having that sharp wall at the bottom, if that would make any difference. The answer, no. But I tried it out. So just I think an 1/8 inch core box here and a 1/4 inch core box there, done just enough to get into the maple, get the full radius of that core box bit into the maple. So you can see they're different depths, but I went deep enough again to get that full radius in there. So this one looks a little bit nicer. I think it came out pretty well. It gives you some interest from the side because you got that lamination where the maple and the oak, if you're looking at it from the side before you get around to see the picture in front. See how we're doing on time. We're all right. So that's kind of our modern piece here. After doing those two channels there, I thought, well, let's go back to filling those channels. So you can see here we've got a bead routed on the outside edge. Did my two channels here. Apparently I still had the core box bit in the router table. You can see there's a little gap down there. Worked out just fine. Nobody's ever going to see that once you get the piece put together. So just routed a shallow kerf at the router table, and then using this is the exact same bead we saw earlier on that maple and walnut piece that's going around. I had some of that left over. So this went on the outside edge there, and I think kind of works the opposite of some frames where it kind of climbs from the outside up instead of slanting down toward the pieces being displayed. And then once we got the stain on it, and then I left it out in the sun to get some aged cherry on it, it ended up looking, I think, pretty nice. Nice contrast between the maple and the, oh, you know, there's one thing I wanted to mention. Where's the, that one there, the mahogany with the maple inlay? Maybe you've noticed those two pieces of maple are markedly different, aren't they? So that's one where frankly, I was just making a prop for class, so I put those two pieces together. If I was making a frame, I'd examine that a little more closely, make sure those colors match at that corner before putting those together. So now everything is so far kind of been flat, and the next thing I wanted to experiment with was doing a bit of an angle. Had something that kind of angled out from the back of the frame, kind of stood proud a little more. So what I came up with was taking a piece of cherry, this is where this started, routing a 1/4 inch cove on that edge. Then I did a bevel rip. So this edge here is bevel ripped at this table saw. with the cove up 15 degrees. Then I took it over and started nibbling away at this little rabbit again. This is to, again, register those two pieces together so my molding is consistent. Now you might think the easiest way to do this is with a dado blade, but what I found is by making progressive passes with a single blade, starting at this point and working out until I had just a sliver here and then stopping. So again, I've got, as I'm working the table saw, this is supporting the piece, and on that last pass, there's a little sliver left out here that's still supporting the piece. Then I remove that last sliver with a chisel. But I found that working with a single blade and making multiple passes like that makes this more consistent, makes this angle more consistent with this, more closer to parallel. If you had a dado blade set up, well, part of your blade is higher at one point of the table than it is at the other, so that will change this angle here. Nothing wrong with that, but if you want this piece to be flat like I did, you'd have to then change the bevel here to accommodate whatever your dado blade cut. So by nibbling away with just a single blade, we kept this reasonably close to parallel with the outside edge. Then another 15-degree cut where my blade was already set, and I've got a bevel here that nests very nicely. Now you notice this because of nibbling away with that single blade, I've got some ridges here. It's not a perfect joint. But again, we're not building furniture here. We're not gluing up a panel. I don't care. I took a chisel to that and kind of knocked off the worst of the ridges, sanding block to take care of a little bit of the rest, and there was plenty of glue surface there to keep these two pieces together. So there's walnut with our cherry trim. Then I got to thinking, how about some other inlay materials? And this one I actually had to make a whole frame for to show you the effect. This is a walnut frame. The frame itself couldn't be simpler. It's square. But what I wanted to do was try inlaying some different materials. And this is just aluminum bar stock that I got at the home center. So I just put the, let me switch over here. Well, I think I'd do it up here. Put the frame together, or I'm sorry, I milled all my pieces to size. And then what I had to do here was actually cut my frame pieces to length, to finished length, because I had to know the finished length to find the positioning for these aluminum pieces here, because I was measuring from a corner to locate those. So I have all my pieces cut to length, then just angling the miter gauge 45 degrees to match the miters on the corner, and I measured out and then just cut to a mark. I didn't use any kind of indexing on this. I just marked where I wanted them and then cut to the mark on both sides. And then put aluminum bar stock. I think it comes in a flat bar. I ripped some pieces on the saw earlier, and then glued those in so they're standing proud. I used epoxy on this. You'll be able to see the epoxy pretty clearly as this comes around. Let me go ahead and switch over here, and Paul can get a preview for you before it gets to you. So, yeah, look at your focus there. Good. So you'll be able to see there's small little areas here where I was a little less than perfect, and the epoxy is visible, primarily because I used a dark epoxy. In hindsight, the better choice would be a clear epoxy. Find something that dries clear, isn't going to draw attention to itself. But this one I liked because I think you could use this frame in just about any orientation. It looks pretty good in that orientation. I think that makes pretty nice action going one way. And this one, I saw this orientation and thought, ooh, Mount Fuji. Doesn't that work fairly well? I mean, that mirrors the lines of the mountain pretty well, doesn't it? And had I known Mount Fuji was going to go in here, I might have actually put them at the top to echo the mountain a little better. But it also, it works in that direction too. Get something moving left to right. You got a sports car, you're an archer, you got the quills of your arrow. A lot of things with that little frame. So every frame you've seen so far has been mitered, hasn't it? That's not the only joint that you can use to join pieces in a square fashion to make a frame. So the last frame I want to show you here is really kind of a hybrid. It's just using half-lap joinery. But I use this one example to show 3-4 different ways of applying a half-lap joint. So at the top, I've got a half-lap joint, but you can see it's flush, the style's flush with the rail, and the rail stands proud. Down here at the bottom, we've got just the opposite, kind of a Lincoln log look here, where both the rail and the style stand proud of each other. Where typically when you think of a half lap, everything's flush on the ends. The corners are flush, the edges are flush with the faces, so everything, just like a regular frame, will be flush. Doesn't necessarily have to be that way, does it? The other thing I did here was I didn't cut my half lap so the faces were perfectly flush, which is what you would typically do. You could have a half lap that exactly half the depth of your workpiece, and things will be flush all the way around. So this one, you've just got the pieces standing a little bit proud. I think gave it a little bit more character. I wanted to see what it looked like, and I thought it turned out pretty well. This would be great for a rustic, you know, you got your prize trophy buck, put him in there. I did not route a rabbit around the back of this one, just because, well, time being what it is sometimes. But for the purpose of the class, I wanted to see that half laps can be a perfectly good joint for your frames too, and exceptionally strong. Well, big frames, half lap gives you tons of glue surface, face-to-face glue surface, so it's a real good choice. In my basement, I've got a big frame that I made. It's probably 4 foot by 4 foot. It's a couple of National Geographic maps of the U.S. that I got from my dad. They're just mounted on spray foam. It's not a big deal, but it's a big frame. And I just wanted a frame that was going to stay square and was easy to put together, so I used half-lap joints to put that one together. And the thing to be aware of course, is you're going to have end grain showing somewhere. Just choose whether you want it at the top or at the sides. And typically, if you put it at the top and the bottom, it's a little less visible. So let's talk a little bit about, since we're talking about reinforcing the joints, finding some strong joinery. Someone mentioned earlier about the little biscuit you could see inside those miters. That's a perfectly acceptable way to put together a frame. Some of these smaller frames, though, you're going to see they're too small for biscuits. I think most everything I put together, if I recall, there might be an exception or two, but I used a mini biscuit jointer. I've got a Ryobi mini biscuit jointer. I'm not even sure if they make it anymore. But a good substitute is to get a slot cutter bit, and it'll cut, get something that cut about a 1/4 inch slot, and use that to cut, as you would a biscuit jointer, to cut small slots in there. Then you can make your own biscuits using 1/4 inch plywood or whatever 1/4 inch scrap you have lying around. It takes a little bit of effort to make those, but I mean, if you're only making 4, or if you're making even if you're making 5 frames, you only have to make 20 of them and make them fit. Another tactic, we know you've probably seen splines in miter joints. That one's common enough. I'm not even going to mention that, but you can do it on the table saw. This is another little method. When you're using miter joints, you don't want to use a spline. You got something that's too narrow to get a biscuit in. Flip over the back, get a Forstner bit, drill a shallow hole, and then glue in a piece of whatever you got laying around. In this case, it's hardboard, but a better choice would be hardwood. Something that's, not this could delaminate, but this is going to be a strong joint. This is going to last. So that's an option too. Get your Forstner bit out and drill a reinforcement for your miters. Splines, when you're cutting a spline down the joint itself, you get a nice accent piece there. But you can choose to make it an accenting wood. So if I was going to put mahogany in a maple piece like this, or if I want to kind of make it a little more subtle, make the splines out of the same species. So you have maple on maple, for example. And what you get there is just a kind of a subtle effect from the differences in the wood grain that give you a real subtle accent. That's pretty much what I've got lined up for you today. If there are questions, I'd be happy to answer those, and I'll also be sticking around a little bit after class here to answer questions.